Okay, and we are recording. Hi, this is Matt Menifee with University High School Forensic Science, and I'm here with retired uh, Officer Dennis Baier. Mr. Baier, would you go ahead and just kind of tell us what you did before you retired in law enforcement? And we'll just start with that.
Okay, yeah, I started really almost as a uh, whim. I had a friend of mine that always wanted to be a cop, and I never really had an expressed interest in that. But he went down and applied for Waco PD, and he told me, he said, Dennis, why don't you come down there with me? And I said, no, I really don't have a desire to be a cop. And he goes, well, would you rather be the chasee or the chaser? So I said, I'd been the chasee enough times. I said, let me try this. So I went down there and they hired me and didn't hire him, unfortunately. Of course, at the time I had, I guess you'd call it at that time, 73, long, kind of long hair and a mustache like I have now, and sometimes a beard. And I think that was one of the main things that they were, at that time, police officers couldn't have any facial hair. And they made a big deal on that in the interview. But I said, if push comes to shove, the hair will grow back. So anyway, they hired me, and I spent about a year and a half in patrol. And then they asked me to go to narcotics, and I said, sure, I'll see what this is like. So the whole training, which was really tragic when I look back on it, but and there's much more extensive training now than there was. But my extent of training to be a narcotics agent, now to be a patrolman or join the police department, we went through 16 weeks of work, both physical as well as work. Hold on.
Okay.
Hey, let me let the dog outside real quick.
All right, I'll pause it real quick.
Okay.
Recording.
We're back at it.
We're back up.
That's it. Okay. So anyway, my entire training basically back at that time, and that was in about the end of 75, the first of 76. I said, grow your hair, grow a mustache and beard, and go into bars and buy dope. And of course I said, really? And you're going to pay me to do that? And they said, sure. So that was basically the extent of my training at the time. And that's what I did. I went to bars and bought dope and spent the city's money. The first deal I ever did, I went to a bar off of North 19th Street. It was a pool hall and bar. And I was shooting pool with a guy, and there was another guy over there working a payphone. Now, again, I don't know how many your students know what a payphone is, but you put coins in a slot and you dial a number. And so he was working that phone. He was putting in dimes and making phone calls. A few minutes later, he'd get a phone call, and I could tell he was doing business. So I just went up to him and said, hey, dude, what's happening? And he goes, nothing much. I said, what are you doing? I said, are you working? He goes, yeah, what do you need? And I said, well, I'd like some meth, or crystal is what we call it. And he says, sure. So he says, come on out back with me. So I go out back with him, and there's no light out back, and we get into this two-door car, and there's another guy in it. So I get in the back seat. Nobody knows where I am. Don't have a backup. And so anyway, I'm sitting back there, and he hands me the dope, and I hand him the $20. The sale is finished, so I know nobody told me what I had to do then. And they gave these little bitty badges out as detectives. They're about that big and can't hardly read them. So anyway, I said, well, I'm going to make this arrest. So I flipped that badge out. And now I'm in this back seat of this car, and a two-door car, and I put it between them. And one of them looks at it and laughs and says, I got one just like that. I bought it at Ben Franklin's store. And so I knew that was a no-win situation for me. So I basically said, yeah, I was just jacking with you to see if I could get your adrenaline running. So anyway, they ultimately let me out, and we end up making an arrest on both of them for delivery of methamphetamine. Um, and from there, it was, like I say, it was quite an experience for me. I worked in narcotics for about 2.5 years, and then was transferred to auto theft for about 8 months, and then back to narcotics for about a year. I then made sergeant, and they ship you back to patrol. And I was there for probably just less than a year, and was put on a special assignment. It was around the time of the triple murder. I was assigned with another officer to do follow-up investigations on, because when all that happened, nothing like that had ever happened in Waco.
Let's pause for just a second, Mr. Baier. Can you tell us about the triple murder?
Yeah.
Because most of my students have never heard of it, don't know the story. So if you can just give us the full, kind of the full background on that case.
Yeah, and I apologize. I should have snapped on that.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Yeah, what happened was, it was in '82, I think. But in '82, there were two kids that were going to the Methodist home, and one of the female had moved back home to Waxahachie. And while she was down here at the Methodist home, she worked part-time at the Ranger Hall of Fame. She and her close friend from Waxahachie drove down here, picked up the check, and then they went to go meet a young man that was friends with them. And the three got in the car together. We're assuming that they met at Caney Park, because that's ultimately where his car was found. And of course, the fathers and mothers all called in missing persons that evening because they didn't return to where they were supposed to. So that next day, a fisherman was fishing going down towards Spiegelville, and the boy was laid out in the kind of there was two dirt roads that formed a Y, and he was laid right in the middle of that Y, not in the middle of the Y. He was propped up against a tree, had his clothes on, and had his sunglasses on, but he was dead.
Okay.
So anyway, a search ensued, and they ended up finding the two females who had been sexually assaulted and were naked when they were found. The police department there probably were 6 or 8, maybe 10 investigators and administrative staff, as well as commanders, supervisors, assigned just that. And that went on for a period of about a month. And then
during that month, y'all are just collecting evidence, interviewing
correct.
people. So I'm guessing you talked to the family. What were you looking for at that point? Just reason?
Yeah, I wasn't really involved in that aspect of it. I was still in patrol before they pulled me out, but basically that's what happens, especially when you have a car found in one location, and then you have the bodies found all the way across the lake.
Okay.
So you have basically two crime scenes, and the forensic and the evidence investigation has jumped years ahead from what we had in 70 or in 82, because at that time, truly, and you can see news pictures of it, there were news people and a bunch of people walking around Spiegelville Park where the kids were found. And in today's time, that whole park would have been closed off. That whole park, Spiegelville, I don't remember whether it's 1 or 3, but it would have been sealed off because it had a gate already. And anybody that entered that would have had to sign a name, their name and the purpose for being there. So, again, our evidence collections just jumped eons from that time. Caney Park was not closed, and it could have been closed easily, but it wasn't. And then it wasn't until months after the investigation that I got involved in it that we even did a grid search at Caney Park looking for anything that might have been there or help us lead us to evidence.
But that was months after the actual
Yeah,
event.
that was, yeah.
So
And
did y'all find any evidence during the grid search? Or do you remember?
Well, there was a necklace found that one of the mothers claimed was her daughter's, but the description was so vague and commonplace that there's really no way you could say it was evidence. I mean, it was just, it really wasn't evidence, but per se, I guess it could have been used in a court of law. I don't think it ever was.
But I mean, it was like not super high value evidence.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Good point. Because all evidence does have a value to it. Some of it is real strong, and others leads to that strong conclusion. So anyway, I got involved in that, and our assignment was just go over what investigators had already gone over. We were kind of a review committee set up just to make certain that all the rabbit trails had been run.
Okay.
So, and upon reviewing of the report, I knew some of the friends of some of the victims. So that's where we started interviewing them. And ultimately, it led us to suspect the store, the Rainbow store that was directly across from the Methodist home,
And
led us
what was
to
the
him.
Rainbow store?
I'm sorry?
What was the store?
Yeah, it was like a 7-Eleven or it was just a grocery store, sold beer and convenience store.
Beer, gas, and snacks.
And snacks, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir. And the owner of that store had developed and tried to develop a close relationship with a female who looked similar to one of the girls that was killed. I mean, they were, in fact, there were several people where they both worked at the Ranger Hall of Fame together. And even the people down there said that there were times when they would get their names mixed up because they looked so similar. They looked like they could have been twin sisters almost.
Wow.
The other thing that came into focus pretty quick after the other officer and I got involved was he and I went one night and interviewed this girl that was living right behind the Rainbow Drive-In. She had a little apartment there. And we got to talking to her about it. And she told us that Munir, well, I probably shouldn't have said his name, but he's since passed, but he wanted citizenship. He was from a Middle East country.
Okay.
And he offered her to marry, if she would marry him, he would give her like $500. And then he would become a citizen, and then they would get divorced and go on about their way.
Yeah.
She denied, she said, no, I'm not doing that. And I can remember just before we left, I remember asking her, is there any other strange things that he may have said or asked you? And she goes, well, there is one thing. He says, he told me he took a life insurance policy out on me for like $10,000. And I said, do you remember the agent or the company? He goes, no, I never saw it. He just told me that. So I did some checking and, of course, found out that to get an insurance policy, you have to have an insurer's interest. If you're the beneficiary, you just can't get a policy. I can't get a policy on you, and you can't get one on me. So anyway, we were able to and that kind of intrigued us because, I mean, it was, I think it was a $10,000, may have been a $20,000 life insurance policy, but
Which back in that time, $20,000 would be the equivalent to at least $100,000 today minimum.
oh yeah, yeah, because like I say, at that point in time, when I graduated from the academy in '74, I was making $500 a month and paying all my bills and everything else. So it
Yeah,
hadn't grown that much. I mean, yeah, you'd be looking at least $100,000 policy today.
minimum.
Um,
Yeah.
but and that intrigued us. I mean, that was something that providing a motive potentially, especially since the one girl that was living and the one that died looked so close together, and the one that was living had a conflict with the owner of the Rainbow store. And in fact, he had also offered to marry her. We found that out afterwards. She never brought it up, and we'd interviewed her 3 or 4 times. So anyway, it rocked and rolled, and we ended up developing probable cause on the owner of the store for the murder,
Okay.
one of the murders.
So at this point, do you have much in the way of physical evidence that's tying the suspect to the victim, as far as physical hands-on? So a lot of it's just you're interviewing, and there's a lot of circumstances that just seem suspect.
Right. I mean, it was, and in fact, I remember going to the judge when we got the arrest warrant signed. Both officers and I said, read it, make certain that you think we have probable cause.
Yeah.
And which is far less than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But we had also heard information from some of his associates that he was planning on going back overseas. So anyway, we arrested him. He denied it, got an attorney, agreed to get on the polygraph, took the polygraph, and the operator comes back and tells us he really didn't show any deception. So we, at that time, we had to let him go. So we let him go. I remember talking to a Baylor professor. I found out a couple of names of some Baylor professors, and we went and visited them at his house, and there were specialists in the Middle Eastern culture, basically, and we're trying to find out whether or not he could pass a polygraph depending upon where and how he was raised. And it was kind of interesting, and the polygraph operator probably should have known that before he got on the polygraph, what the hiccups may have been, but we were unaware at the time. But according to this expert on the Middle East, depending upon what clan you're with, where you're raised, that killing somebody may not cause the same physiological reactions that it would in our society. Almost that if it could be justified. Of course, as the plot thickens, we find out there's a guy named David Wayne Spence. I can say his name because he was convicted and ultimately was executed. But and it just so happened David Wayne Spence, at the time we got into it, had been put in jail on an aggravated sexual abuse where he had stabbed and raped a guy. And so he suddenly became kind of the focus of our major assault. Now, we still looked at the owner as potentially either an unwitting or knowing person involved in it by setting it in motion, saying, David, and this was the theory, David, if you kill them, I'll give you $5,000 because I got a $10,000 life insurance policy on Gail, and I'll give you half of it. And that's kind of our thinking at the time, even though we really didn't have a lot of evidence leading us that way. And like I say, this investigation, I was involved in it for over a year. Me and another officer were assigned to the district attorney's office after they kind of took it over to assist them. But ultimately what happened was Uh, David went to jail, or he was in jail on that aggravated sexual abuse already. Inmates, of course, were talking about what David was supposedly saying, which I was very leery of that kind of conversation, because if you've been around jails, all you got to do is let one person know that if I hear this, it's going to help you. Or if you can find this out for me, I can go to the DA's office and it'll help you. And next thing you know, everybody's coming up with stories that aren't, they're just making them up. And you have to be real suspect of inmate testimony. So anyway, we arrested two brothers that were friends of David. One of them was in jail for a physical assault and burglary out of Corpus Christi. And the other one went to jail for something out of Waco. I don't remember exactly what it was. But anyway, one of the brothers confessed to the murder, and that he and his brother and David, of course, his first confession left out his brother. But through more, which is understandable because he's trying to protect his brother. And, but he ultimately ended up bringing his brother into it, as well as confessing to David and them raping the kids and killing them. And that's, like I say, that's kind of the triple murders in a nutshell.
Yeah. And so for my students who don't remember this, there would have been no way for DNA testing at that time, because DNA testing wouldn't have been on the books as a technology for another 15 years. And it wouldn't have even been available in the States until 1996, 97, 98.
It was I think the mid 90s.
Mid 90s at the earliest. And at the time, at that point, we probably only have 4 or 5 people maybe in the state of Texas that could even do DNA testing, because it was such a new technology. So what happens to, obviously one of the people, the person, so what was the final sentence on it?
Okay, David got the death penalty. The two brothers they pled guilty to 2 murders, and they got 2 life sentences. Since then, both of them have passed, I think, in the penitentiary. Now, the owner of the Rainbow Drive-In, he was convicted on the first time. It was appealed and remanded back to the court for retrial. I'm not for certain of the specific reasons. In the second trial, it was a hung jury, and they never tried him again, but he ultimately got involved in the Dallas area with some criminal activity and went to jail, and ultimately ended up dying of a heart attack, I think.
Yeah. So why did he get the death penalty? Was it because he never confessed, or is it?
According to the 2 that did confess, now you bring up a valid point, because the 2 brothers had already confessed to it. Now, their confessions were not glove tight, which you wouldn't really want. Yeah. But David denied it all the way up to it. In fact, I'll be quiet. We did have some forensic evidence, and that was bite marks. And what was unique about that situation was there was an assistant DA that moved from Amarillo that had a case where bite marks was involved. The forensic pathologist that did the autopsy never noticed them. So she interpreted them at that point in time as insect bites. And so anyway, this is maybe pretty close to 8 months after the initial deal. This ADA, assistant DA, was looking at the photographs and noticed, he said, "Man, that looks like a bite mark to me. And there's another one." Of course, we didn't have any measurements other than the fact that one of the photographs had a necklace in it. We had the necklace, so we could use that as a comparative analysis as to the depth and length and width of the bite mark. So we took plaster photographs and plaster casts of David's teeth. and we took it to a forensic odontologist in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he identified David Spence as being the one that bit the girl.
Out of all three of the people?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And now I also have to make a comment that at this point in time, when I was last there, forensic odontology did not have a strong reputation
Yeah.
in the criminal justice system because of the it's just you're working with a skin that's going to move, and unless you've got a really strange bite, it's almost practically impossible, what I've read, that to actually link A to B.
Yeah, and that's still very much the case. That it's, even though it's still allowed by the courts, because you know how that works. One court has said, "Hey, this is okay," and now we've got precedent, and so it's still allowed by the courts. But even the National Forensic Science Council has come out and said, it's very limited in the scope of what you can pull off. And I think having a direct comparison, you're probably better off than saying, than some of the other things. Like they completely overturned, they convicted a guy and sent him to the death penalty over a bite mark in a sandwich.
Oh.
And the odontologist was very much not a quote unquote scientist. He liked to refer to himself as an artist. He could see these details even if nobody else could. And of course, it got overturned when the defense attorney was able to present a sandwich eaten by his golden retriever that had a very similar pattern, and the guy couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah. Well, and I also remember I contacted another forensic odontologist out of San Diego and asked him if he would review them. And he said, "Yeah, bring him out." And I told him then that, hey, I wanted to let you know that one forensic odontologist has already looked at him. And he goes, "I can tell you who it is." And he told me who he was. And I said, he and I have been on opposite sides. In fact, the defense called the one from San Diego to testify. And he did testify that they were bite marks. But in his opinion, he could not determine who bit that woman.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's, it's most certainly not like DNA.
No. And the thing is, what we've learned is, DNA has a high degree of reliability, but usually the problem with DNA is user error in testing it.
Really?
Yeah, if there's going to be a problem with the DNA, it's probably because somebody didn't collect the sample properly or cross-contaminated a sample.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to comment when you mentioned it about back in '82. We had no idea of DNA, and even if we had I don't know that we had the training or expertise to be able to know how to collect it and store it until the test came back. Until you could actually test them. So, I mean, that none of us even knew about DNA that I'm aware of, and it was never mentioned in any offense report.
Yeah, and honestly, it would have been cutting edge science that you wouldn't even have heard about outside of a biology conference until the early '90s at most.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right. So, and so we got that case got closed. That was a major case you worked on. So let's go and pivot back to the drug cases. So, what has been one of the during the '80s? What was the drug that was sold most commonly in Waco?
Well, when I first started, I talked to a DEA officer when I first went into narcotics, and that was in 75, 76. He said that more methamphetamine has been produced out of chemists from Central Texas than anywhere else in the country. And so methamphetamine in Waco, Texas in the mid 70s, 80s was a major, major issue. Now it was it was mostly white individuals that were doing methamphetamine at the time. Very few African Americans and few Hispanics. Um, the heroin trade at that time, which has always been around, even like I say in the 70s, heroin
Yeah.
um, was primarily African American area. We when I left in 2013, heroin was becoming much more widely accepted in all races.
Okay.
I mean, we had a lot of young people getting hurt, getting on hydrocodone, and then it was easier to get heroin than it was hydrocodone. So, but in the 80s, it was, of course, marijuana has always been prevalent. But as far as the hard drugs was really methamphetamine and heroin. And cocaine was just making its start. And I remember making the first case, a cocaine case we made out there off of Bosque Boulevard. And, you know, it didn't have an odor. It's white powder, didn't have an odor, and didn't know what it was really, and tested it. And sure enough, it was cocaine. But in the mid 80s, when crack cocaine hit, that was another one that crossed all racial and financial boundaries, drug that was really coveted by a lot of people, crack cocaine. And
Was the crack? So was the crack being processed in Waco from cocaine, or was it like coming from another part of the state, or how was it getting to Waco?
yeah, most of the crack cocaine was coming from Dallas or Fort Worth area. Our heroin was coming from Fort Worth. Methamphetamine was coming from primarily rural areas, cook pots, cooks, rural areas. Um, then in the 80s, methamphetamine changed quite a bit because it was mostly, you know, two or three of us would get together and we go to a motel and put out some bathtub crank is what we called it.
Yeah.
And we would have enough to sell, to buy the product, to make it again, and to do ourselves. And then
So it was basically like use what we can and sell the rest.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
like the old Bluebell commercial.
Yes. Yeah.
We eat what we can and we sell the rest. In this case, we smoke up what we can and we sell the rest.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the way the meth circle was running up until probably the late 80s, early 90s. And then it started to come in much kilo quantities. And it was all being produced in Mexico. And it was a whole lot better quantity. If you got caught with it, it was just mere possession. Unless you got caught with a lot, then it was possession with intent to distribute, which raised the class level. But if you got caught cooking in a motel room, then that was manufactured.
And that's a serious charge.
Yeah, whether you had a gram or a kilo, it was manufactured. So, you know, and generally too, when I started out, there was, I did the first meth manufactured case in McLennan County. And this was in like 76, I think, or 77. But you could smell them cooking meth because of the chemicals they used.
Yeah.
They had to do it in a rural setting or else they had to really know how to ventilate it down the toilet systems. And we have had some doing them in motel rooms and apartments, but most of them were rural settings. But now almost all our meth, or when I retired, most all of it was coming from Mexico.
Yeah. And you know, and most of my students don't know this, and I don't know if you were involved in this. Were you involved in the case in Belle Meade where they busted the meth lab that was across the street from the elementary school?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, and that was one of those ones where it's like, you know, okay, yeah, guys, you're cooking it, but you're kind of cooking it in a place where, you know, you have cops showing up on a regular basis. Something doesn't smell right, and believe me, you know, you got kids around there. They're not gonna, you know, people are protective of kids.
Well, and the other thing too, of course, that was about the time that the legislature had enacted a law stating that if you were possessed, dealt, or manufactured certain drugs within, 1,000 feet of a school,
Yeah.
that accelerated the punishment part. And I know there were several times when a lot of folks got years added to their time just based upon where they sold their dope or where they were living to sell their dope.
Yeah.
And, they were doing it quite close to schools.
Yeah. So take us through kind of how would a regular drug bust operation kind of go for you in the 80s? You said you were undercover, so how would that work? Because obviously you probably got a little bit more advanced technique than you did from your first time jumping in the back of somebody's car.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
so
Well,
how
the
would you
way
start or run an
the
investigation?
okay, a lot of it's going to depend upon your target
Okay.
and what he or she is dealing and the quantities that they're dealing in. But a general rule of thumb is if we put an agent on the street to work undercover, and I don't care if they were just buying crack cocaine, a drive-by crack cocaine deal, or they were having to go into a house or meet a crook, of course, they would be wired for sound. We would have probably a tracking device on his car, his or her car, and then we would have probably 3 or 4 surveillance units, and then we would have a vehicle, probably the largest one we could get, probably a pickup truck with 4 people in it, and they would be the response team. If something went sour, they were the only ones that were assigned to, unless there were other exigent circumstances, but that part of the puzzle was designed to extract the agent out of harm's way. Because to be quite blunt, very seldom did I ever carry a gun when I was working undercover, and I don't know too many of the guys that really did. Um,
I remember I've heard a story at one point from a retired officer, and he said that if you're carrying a gun undercover, a lot of times it was an indication that you were a cop because only a cop would carry a gun undercover.
and that's pretty much the way that I thought. There were times when I was a little concerned about the other thing. Generally speaking, though, if one of my guys were going to meet somebody, uh, then uh, we would know pretty much about him or her, where they live, what their temperament was. Somehow or another, we found out about them through some source, so we could identify his or her propensity for violence. A lot of times, if you're buying weed, generally there wasn't a hassle because they just laid back. Uh, Heroin wasn't really too bad either. It really got ticklish when we started buying, when you're sending somebody in to buy methamphetamine. The other thing on an undercover deal, we always tried to, number one, limit the exposure of the agent to that scene by various means. And so we controlled it a lot more than we did when I first started. Now, search warrant it was different. And we would run probably in the 80s, we would probably write 150 search warrants a year and probably execute 100 or thereabout. Now, some of those search warrants would be on vehicles, or if we ran a federal search warrant, there may be 8 places to search on there. So the number 100 sounds like a lot, but in reality, 6 or 8 of them could have been done at one day with multi-task force type of operation between us and DPS and surrounding agencies and DEA, FBI, and customs. But yeah, and search warrants generally were much more planned out because we dictate the time and the location where we decided to meet with the target. Where in an undercover operation, there's so many variables involved as it progresses along that you have to be adaptable, and you have to set down parameters saying, no, you're not going to get in the car with this person. You're not traveling anywhere with this person. You're not going to front money to this person.
So, so So can you give me a scenario that you had to, hey, the dealers are saying this, you're undercover to buy, and that you had to kind of adapt? What would be? Can you give me
Uh,
one of those
well,
situations?
one of the key things is I don't have I don't have the dope on me. I've got to go get it. And I tell the troops, hey, if it's your connection, you've got to trust him. I don't know you that well. You go get the dope, come back to me, and I'll give you the money and I'll show you the money. Here's the money. Here's the, tech. In fact, we did a deal once for buying a kilo and it was like $15,000. And we showed him the money. And of course, the money makes people do weird things. He goes, okay, I'll be right back. And, no, there's ways you can get out of it. You just have to make certain that the agent understands, and also the follow-up group, because we have had in the past where I've told the agent, you're not getting in the car with them, because if you do, then we're going to take it down. I don't care what happens. And what does the agent do?
Gets in the
He
car.
gets in the car, and I can hear everything's going good over the microphone. So we don't take out the car, and everything works out all right. But too many times, most of the officer shootings that I've been in, where I've read about, have been because of they didn't follow their own rules that they've set up for. And so that's, yeah, it's much more. I mean, now we'll get air support if need be, because DPS, DEA all have those kind of capabilities. In fact, MSO does, McLennan County Sheriff's Office. Well, they used to have a helicopter. I don't know if they still do, but no, yeah. And of course, now we utilize canines in our searches,
Yeah.
which has helped quite a bit.
And I imagine, probably not during your time, but I know even actively right now, a lot of drone usage.
Yeah. In fact, when I was there, we bought our first drone. Now, it was just a little bitty one. If the wind came up too high, we'd lose it. But that was one of the things that our tech guy was experimenting with, to be able to get up. Of course, all of the controls was line of sight, so that kind of inhibited what we could do with it, but we could get it above certain buildings or beside buildings and videotape common areas, street areas, and store areas where we couldn't get in close to.
Yeah.
So yeah, the drones, I'm certain now are maybe not for Waco PD or MSO, but they're available for the feds and the state. I'm positive.
Yeah, I mean, I know both Waco PD and McLennan County Sheriff's Office, they definitely have access to them. They just may not have access to as nice a stuff as the feds do.
Oh, no, the feds are
nice stuff.
Eons ahead of us. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to go through a list of questions that are the kind of the questions my students normally ask you. And just give me your answers. So question one, what they'll always ask is, how many years did you actually serve as a cop?
I started October of 73 and retired December of 14. So that was at 41 years.
Wow. That's a lot of experience.
Well, I tell everybody this is one of the reasons that I was able to survive so long is, number one, I was assigned to narcotics for probably 35 of the years. And fortunately for me, none of the administrators above me really wanted to know what we were doing. I never saw a chief of police. Well, I've seen chiefs of police probably once a year, a captain or assistant chief is what they call them now, probably once a year. And if something bad happened, I'd tell them about it, and then we would discuss it. But I was always going to their building, and so they kind of left us alone over narcotics. I was fortunate not to get involved in in too many of the politics involved in the criminal justice system. And yeah, so, and that's one reason why, because I'm telling you, if you were a person, a troop on the street, having to put that belt and radio and all the gear that they carry in and out of a car every day, and then have to put up with all of the things that you see with, because see, in narcotics, we were in control.
Yeah.
I knew what was going to happen before it happened. So we could plan. We're in patrol, that troop going down the street, his emotions are going to go up and down depending upon if he's stopping somebody for running a red light to working a aggravated robbery or murder or something like that. So his or her emotions are in constant state of flux. And so I was able, like I say, I was able to survive.
Yeah.
And I truly, I did work, was assigned what we called was special crimes back then, where we worked murders, robberies, and rapes. And I look back on it now, and I just don't know. I'm fortunate I got out of it, because I don't know that I could work child cases and murders. When I first started, murders pretty much solved themselves when I got into it. But the more I progressed in it, the more it appeared, well, crack cocaine got involved, and it really appeared that, innocent people, totally not involved in the drug business at all, were getting killed and shot and wounded. And after a while, it takes some toll on your emotions.
Yeah, I know. Earlier this week I interviewed one of the Secret Service liaisons for here in Waco, who specializes in the digital devices, and he said, yeah, 70% of the cases we look at are child pornography cases. And he was, and I asked him, I was like, I've heard a lot of research about that if you do it for a prolonged period of time, you need counseling. And he didn't say anything. Kind of nodded his head a little bit.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine that was in our computer crimes, and I got to talking to him about it, because anytime we'd run a search warrant, of course, we'd take all the hard drives, all the computers, the phones, and then we'd have to have warrants to get in them. And I remember over there talking to him at his office one morning, and he said, man, I'm just glad to see y'all. I said, why is that? He said, because 80-90% of what we get is child pornography. And I go, really?
And
of course, he was doing it they were doing it for multiple counties, yeah, and DPS. So.
And what year would that have been?
That would have been probably in the early 90s.
So even then.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So we only have a few minutes left, and so just a few things. Would you be willing to answer some questions submitted by our students in a later video?
Sure.
Awesome. Well, one of the my students in my advanced class are going to watch this video tomorrow, and I will get them to write some specific questions, because in the advanced class, they've all expressed some degree of interest in going to law enforcement. And so we would love to submit some more questions to you. And I think that's going to be about it for right now. And I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.